I wanted to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that saves you time and money on cross-border transactions. A previous guest, Dan Gardner, spoke about forecasting and risk. One of his central points was, as he put it, the things we're doing now are so incredibly complex, to see even a little bit into the future takes an enormous amount of struggle, and even then we're going to make mistakes. As CEO of Newroll, predicting just 12 months out is hard. As we expand, variables and risks multiply. Anything I can do to take risk off the table is helpful. In the past, I've been blind to the risk of FX exposure in our budgeting. A small movement could eat into our investment budget and compromise our credibility when our forecasts are wrong. If you want to remove risk from your foreign exchanges without breaking the bank, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Newroll, the business podcast that brings the boardroom to you. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Sara Weller CBE is chair of the Money and Pension Service and is currently a non-executive director of BT. Previously, she was senior independent director at Mitchells & Butler plc, a non-executive director of United Utilities, the largest public water company in the UK, Virgin Money, Lloyds Banking Group, where she chaired the Responsible Business Committee, and was a trustee of the Lloyds Bank Charitable Foundation. Sara's executive career spanned roles at Mars, Abbey National, J. Sainsbury's, and latterly as the managing director of Argos. Sara was lead non-executive of both the UK government's Department for Work and Pensions and at the Ministry for Housing, Communications and Local Government, during which time she chaired the Planning Inspectorate. Sara is a vocal advocate for increasing disability inclusion in the workplace and has completed the London Marathon in a wheelchair to raise money for research into multiple sclerosis, a condition she has lived with since 2009. Sara, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my absolute pleasure to be here.
Wow, what an incredible portfolio you have built with a wonderful mix of high-profile government board roles and paid roles across a wide range of sectors. Was that always the plan? And what are the golden threads that tie them all together?
When you add it all up like that, when you stack them all up one after the other, it does look like a long journey. It's partly because I've been in business for 40 years, so you accumulate jobs after a while. No, it wasn't a plan. From the very early age when I left university, I was really interested in government and I was offered a job on the fast stream in the civil service. And I was also really interested in going into business. And in the end, I chose the business route. And then what happened was later on, I went back to pick up the thread of the government route. When I'd climbed a long way up the business ladder and I was broadly satisfied with where I got to, I went and picked up the other thread. So to that extent, it was good to bring the two back together again. But the mix, I didn't ever really aim for. And I didn't understand at the beginning how valuable it would be to have both sides of the coin. The golden thread, I think, that holds them, two things probably that hold them together. I've generally worked on the boards of very big, established, long-standing organisations that are what I would describe as it being the heart of British life. Because I always really wanted to do things that would be visible and meaningful to people. So I wanted to work in companies that were sort of high street names or in the government. And that's been one thread that's brought them together. But the other thread that's brought them together over time is a passion for customers and a real desire to change organizations for the better in terms of how they serve their customers. And that increasingly also means thinking about how they're treating the people who work for them, because it's those people who deliver the experience for the customer. So what you really try to do is once you realize you want to help the customer, you have to step one back into the business and then you have to help the people. I think that's whether I've been in DWP or at Lloyds, those are the things that I commonly am thinking about on the board.
Are there big differences between those government board roles and the paid roles that are common to each?
There are differences. I think in many ways there are also more similarities than people would expect. So when I was on the board at Lloyds Bank, they had about 70,000 people. Those people were in branches, but they were also in processing centres across the country. I was also on the board at DWP. They also had 70,000 people. They also had people in branches effectively called job centres and processing centres around the country. And the challenges of leading people, creating strategy, transforming organizations when they're distributed like that are very similar between the two. And I did quite a lot of work between Lloyds and DWP trying to join them up, introduce the people at the top of one organization to the others because they were facing lots of very similar challenges. So to that extent, there was lots of read across. But there is one fundamental difference, I think, about the two. In business, you are in a competitive marketplace. And the drive to innovate and change is an existential one, because if you don't change to reflect what the customer needs are, and the person operating next to you does, then your customers move from you to them. And that's a real drive to put pace into the risks that you take and the innovation you do, because it's a matter of life and death. If you don't do it, somebody else will take your business. In government, it's generally not the same thing. So there isn't a competitor alternative to a job centre, for example. And government operates on very big systems with millions of people involved in them. And therefore, they neither have to innovate and change so rapidly because there's nobody chopping at their heels. But equally, the system's so big and complicated that you really don't want to change unless you're very sure you understand what benefit the change is going to bring and what the potential unintended consequences are. So there's a very different balance in terms of the pace at which you change, which is not because the government is slow and bureaucratic, but it's simply a reflection of two systems and how they operate. And what drives your innovation in the commercial world is competition and the risk of being out-competed. In government, it's about stability and the importance of making change only when you fully understand what you're going to change and how it's going to work.
That really echoes what a recent guest, John Manzoni, talked about of his experience of government versus the commercial world and how much humility he had to bring to that role of not immediately assuming things were obvious, but actually they're just so much more complex in that government environment because you've got so many more stakeholders that you're dealing with. You took on your first board position 10 years before concluding your executive career, whereas many leave it until they're about to retire from executive life. How do you think about that now with the benefit of hindsight? And what do you advise the executives on your boards when they come to think about non-executive roles?
I'm a big advocate of starting reasonably early. I think two reasons, one of which is I think when you're doing your executive role, you learn a lot from being involved in somebody else's business because all of a sudden you see through a fresh pair of eyes what a business looks like. And in the particular instance I joined a company called Mitchells and Butlers. They were a big runner of pubs and restaurants and casual dining. And actually they had a whole series of brands from sort of Toby and Harvester all the way through to more premium dining brands. And I was working in a retailer that had one brand. And actually what I really learned from them was about different dynamics of what were happening in those different layers of customers. It was a time of a lot of credit crunch and people were downsizing their expenditure. And so you saw people moving from the slightly more premium brands down through the brands, which was really interesting for me because I ran, as I say, a single brand at Sainsbury's, but it had tiers of products in it. So I had taste difference products right the way down to value essentials. And I could think about the way my customers were moving through the layers by looking at the way that their customers were transitioning through brands. So there was no competition. We weren't in the same market in any way, but there was lots of opportunity to reframe what you were seeing in your own business by listening to somebody else talking about theirs. And simple things like they did a really great job of developing strategy in a really simple way. And I would go back to my business and go, why can't our strategy process be like that? Because that looks a lot easier. Second reason is when you come to leave as an executive, and you want to get a non-executive job. And of course, you've moved quite a bit further up the structure. You want to get a non-executive job that's roughly at the same layer. But the headhunters understandably want to be confident that you're going to be a good non-executive. And it's not the same as being a good executive. And so if you started earlier and you've built up maybe not just one example, but maybe 2 or 3 examples of different places you've been a non-executive, it gives a lot more credibility to your proposition to the headhunter that you'd like to become a non-executive at a similar level to your executive life. Because they have a lot more confidence that you know what you're doing. Whereas all too often, I think, if you leave it too late, you come out as an executive, you think that being a non-executive is a bit like being an executive, only you do it 1 or 2 days a week rather than 5. And that is not at all what it's about. And being able to show the headhunter that you understand that is critical to being able to get a job at the right sort of level when you decide you're going to transition completely.
I always counsel people to take a role as soon as they're able to get one. Do you think you can ever go too early?
I think there is a slight risk of going too early because I think if you're not careful and you haven't got quite enough executive experience, then the role as a non-executive you take can be too small. And because as a non-executive, in general, you do about 6 years. I mean, you can potentially do 9. I did 9 at Lloyds and 8 at United Utilities. And therefore, if you're not careful, you get something too small and you spend 9 years doing it. And then when you're ready to retire and go non-exec, your experience is in too small a business. And so the headhunter missizes you, if that makes sense. So I was lucky. I joined Mitchells & Butlers. It was a FTSE 250. And I spent 7 years there actually until there was a lot of disruption towards the end with shareholder activity. And then I moved into a couple of government. I did 2 or 3 government jobs as well because I was interested in seeing that side of it, knowing that I ditched it earlier in my choice architecture. And therefore, when I came out to apply for a proper non-exec, I had both those clusters of experience. I also had the luck that I was coming out of my executive life at a time when the 30% Club was really getting underway and boards were beginning to think about they wanted women on their boards, but they ideally wanted women who'd run things rather than women who'd been a functional head, maybe in law or in legal or in HR, say. And I had run Argos. It was a £4 billion business, 25,000 people plus. And so I had the good fortune to be just the sort of shape of person that they wanted. And maybe I was a little bit inexperienced to join the Lloyds board, for example, as a FTSE 30, but I'd had enough non-exec experience. I had experience in the right place that they wanted, which was customers. I was a bit of a risk, but I was probably a better risk than doing some other, you can build your own experience, do the best you can to make yourself marketable. And then you need a little bit of luck. I think either a headhunter that really likes you or an exec who thinks you've got just the right experience or something like the 30% Club, which sort of changes the backdrop of what you're applying against. Yeah. So I had a combination of good fortune and good backup that got me into really great led jobs in which I learnt loads.
I think lots of people struggle with how to articulate the value they bring as a NED. And often they've been very successful in some field or another, but they struggle to appreciate the level of competition that's out there. That there are lots of extraordinary people. You touched on there, you'd run a very large business. Timing, the macro context was helpful. And as you said, as I think all the best leaders I know always attribute a certain amount to luck as well. But is there anything else for someone listening to this, thinking, how do I make myself stand out as much as I can?
The thing I often say to people when they come to me to talk about how did you and what could I be doing differently? And I say to them that the difference between being a non-executive and an executive is when I was running Argos, if you looked at the job spec, I had to be good at pretty much everything in the job spec because there was only me. So it had to come from me. And I had to be able to do it myself, demonstrate I could lead it and I could understand other people doing it. So job spec, and I had to do all of it. When you come to be a non-executive director, you don't have to, there's no job spec, you have to do everything. So you sit on a board with, I don't know, maybe half a dozen, maybe 10 other people, depending on how big the board is. And you've all got different skill sets. So what you need to do is demonstrate that you are in the top echelon of people with your sort of skill set. I didn't need to demonstrate I understood treasury or capital markets or even, risk to a high extent detail. What I had to demonstrate was that I had a really good understanding of customers, service propositions, brands, colleague motivation and retention, culture development, because actually that was the bit of the agenda that I could contribute to. And so my challenge was to say, how can I show I'm really experienced in these things and relate all the things I've done to show that I've got a good breadth of understanding in here. So what I say to people is don't worry about everything in the job spec, work out the bits of your experience that would make you really useful, and then try to find organizations which want what you've got to offer. I went to the 2 organizations I ultimately joined, Lloyds and United Utilities. Both were in the process of wanting to transform their organizations to be more customer focused and to think about how they build a business that was focused on customers through products and services and culture and stuff. And of course, that was exactly what I'd been doing at Argos. It was what I was doing at Abbey National before that and at Sainsbury's. So I could show several examples, really good, detailed examples of things I'd actually done at a big scale as an executive. So that's the first thing, is work out what you're really great at, find organizations who want what you're good at, and learn how to describe what you've done in a really tangible way, not just a generic way, but actually show examples of when you've done stuff. And that's really important. And then the second really important thing is to think about how you will be as a board member, because you are being recruited into a team. So when I'm building a board, I'm building a team. And it's not simply 6 of the very best individuals. It's 6 people with excellence who can blend together into making a whole. And so you have to think about how will your expertise that you've just demonstrated that I'm really brilliant at these things translate into you contributing that through the working of a team rather than you as an individual. So find examples where you've not necessarily had line control over everything, where everybody's just done what you've said largely, but where you've had to work in groups where you maybe had to influence people, you didn't have line control, you'd work together to collaborate.
Can you bring that to life for me with an example? Imagine I was the chair, or listeners are the chair of BT, and asking you, Sarah, can you explain to us how could you help with that understanding of a sort of customer voice?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. So there was, for example, in BT, we have a range of brands. So we have the BT brand, we have the EE brand, we have the PlusNet brand. And that's actually quite an unusual structure to have a business with multiple brands that are customer facing in one market, in a single UK market, the same form. Lloyds had exactly the same. So Lloyds had the Lloyds brand, it had the Halifax brand, it had the Scottish Widows brand, it had some online brands like Birmingham Midshires. So I could talk to them about branding in the context of how a customer base that looks pretty much the same demographically in your different brands, attitudinally can be really different. Actually, in the Lloyds customers and the Halifax customers looked the same demographically, but they were really different in their attitudes to finance and what they really wanted out of a brand. So I could show that in a technical sense, I could understand that, and I'd had experience of doing that before. And then in terms of the customer voice, and I am a massive advocate of getting the customer voice into the boardroom. I've been in organizations where, frankly, I haven't really understood the product. When I moved from selling confectionery to selling bank accounts, I really didn't understand banking very much. So what I did was I spent a load of time with the customers. Good news, the customers didn't understand banking either. And it also meant that when I went to the board and said, look, these products you're trying to sell are really complicated. If I'd not talked to the customers, they looked at me and go, but you're just a bit stupid, aren't you? Because they're really very simple products, because they're bankers and they think they're really simple. And I could say, actually, it's not me that tells you they're complicated. The customer says they don't understand these products. So they're buying stuff they don't really know what it's going to do. And they're not buying it because they don't understand it. So the voice of the customer is a very powerful thing, because even though people can tell you that your opinion is wrong, it's really hard for them to say the customer's opinion is wrong. So if you stand behind the customer, you get all that weight. And then I think it's about how do you actually make that come to life for people. So with my management team in Argos, we used to go and sit behind a window of a customer research group viewing, and we used to listen to the customers talk about the service in the store. And we had one particular store, which I won't name, which we regularly went to sit behind customer groups, and the store was not delivering good service. And when the customer described what was happening to them in the store, the whole management team wanted the floor to open up and eat us. You know what I mean? We were looking at each other going, oh my goodness, are we really doing that to people in shops? And then your desire to change stuff for the human being that you've seen describing the problem is of an order of magnitude more powerful than seeing the same statistics on a page of numbers. When we're human beings, when we watch human beings describe in their own words what they're seeing and feeling, if it's not great, your heart sinks, and then you go, I've got to fix that for that person. And for example, I chair the Money and Pension Service. Last board meeting, we had a gentleman join us who was a debt advisor in one of the place called Money Buddies in Leeds. And he was talking to us about the sort of debt advice he was given today versus what he was given 3 years ago and how much more complex it was. And he showed us some pictures of the queue of people waiting around the block for his debt advice centre to open at 9:30. And they had carrier bags full of stuff. And he said people come into the debt advice centre with their carrier bags, they turn them upside down, they let the paper fall on the desk. They go, that's all the demand notices for bills that I've not answered. Please help me. And as a way of enabling the team to really understand the human experience of what's going on, we talk a lot about demand in debt advice being more than supply. But actually, that's a very esoteric way of describing it. He was saying demand is more than supply. I've got these people standing around there. And he said, I won't get to all of them in the 3 hours of my debt clinic. I know I won't, because it takes me 2 hours and I've only got so many debt advisors, so the people at the back of this queue won't get seen. And that's what demand exceeding supply means. I can deal with it when it just says demand is more than supply. When I see it's people with carrier bags full of unpaid bills that they can't show anybody to get any help because the clinic doesn't have enough advisors, that's a completely different way of expressing the same problem and much more likely to generate people to do something than the numbers themselves.
Really powerful. And your example there made me smile because it reminds me of a recent experience I had with a bank, not any of the banks that you sit on the board of, like you'll be pleased to hear, where it was a comedy sketch as I got bounced from one call centre to the next with each of them pointing at each other, blaming them. And it did make, I was sitting there thinking, has anyone on this board actually experience this as a customer, because this is mad. And some of the things I'm being told are mad. And it reminded we used to have, back in my investment days, one of the things that all the board members had to do was go and work at least one day a year behind the till. So they were just really experiencing the customer journey and the employee journey as well. Is that the sort of thing that you're doing and with banks? Are you a sort of customer of all the products?
Yes, I always move my business to wherever I am. So I have lots of products with Lloyds still, and lots of products with Virgin Money, who I've relatively recently stopped up there. And actually what's also quite funny is when I was in retail, not so easy to move in banking, but when I was in retail, I used to take my mum and other people in my family with me as customers, so they would also move. When my daughter was working for Ocado, I moved my business to Ocado. So as a family unit, we all move. We're very loyal to each other. And it is great that, although sometimes I find that the processes and the products that people of my sort of age and level will be buying and using are often the bits that work quite well. Actually, it's not the same experience as people who are maybe taking debt credit products or something with a bank. So last week, I was listening to pension calls, because we do a lot of pension advice pension guidance, in MAPS. I was listening to calls, and it was really interesting because people were asking questions that I would know the answer to, but they wouldn't. And actually, they often come to us because they want advice. And actually, we're not allowed to give advice. We're not regulated, so we have to give guidance. So it's really difficult for the colleagues because the customer's answering questions they know the answer to, but they know they're not allowed to tell the customer the answer. And quite often the customers don't have good English, so pensions is really complicated. And if you then compound it with people whose English is not great, for them to try to explain their problem over the phone to somebody who's only able to answer parts of it and not other, it's really complicated. And so that drive for us to be working with the government to think about where that boundary lies between advice and guidance, and is it in the right place? Are we stopping too soon and people could actually be safely given advice, but we're currently not allowed to do that? That's all helped by having listened to the calls. So I can actually explain to somebody why it matters where the advice and guidance boundary is, which sounds, again, quite esoteric. But when you translate it into what does it mean for the people who need the help, it makes a lot more sense to say this is an important issue rather than just something that sounds very technical and needs to sit somewhere in the governance section. You know what I mean? It's actually a real driver of the way we can or can't help people on the ground.
How do you take those experiences that you get from having done those sorts of deep dives back into the boardroom? Because I'm always very conscious when I've had an experience there's an organization I used to sit on the board of where I was a natural customer of them. And I was always very wary about my anecdotal experiences overwhelming the data and thinking about how do you frame the questions in such a way that it's not seen to be pejorative.
No, exactly. And it's a really good question because I know when I started in banking, the board culture was quite dissociated from the customer. And in that context, people are very resistant when you bring your anecdotes in because they think they've got a map of the world and your anecdote doesn't fit. Once you build a board culture that said customers really matter and the way they're experiencing the brand really matters. And we have it at BT. We certainly got it at Lloyds in the end. In that context, what you can say is, I know this isn't entirely representative, but my mother, who's 96, had this experience, or you've sent her this stuff and she's not going to be able to deal with it. So I know, in a sense, my anecdote isn't exactly the same for everybody, but I also know that probably the majority of people who are over 90 will be feeling like my mother is. It's not necessarily the same as everybody, but there's no reason why my 96-year-old mother shouldn't be feeling the same as other 90-year-olds. You know what I mean? And so I think if the board is already happy to accept that individual customers, and a customer experience is only made up of the customer experience of all the individual customers. So actually it does matter. You win battles with customers, one customer at a time. We've got 20 million customers, but we've got 20 million individuals. And actually the totality of their experience is only the totality of 20 million individuals getting experience. And if we have an experience that is likely to be representative of other customers of a similar type, then people are engaged with that. And because you can bring a lot more passion to it, because just as I've listened to calls, I've sat with my mother who's worried about some of the things that are going to happen to her telephone. And I can explain to the board just how that feels to my mother. And I watch her and she gets very upset about stuff. And that power of being able to turn again the numbers into what does it mean at a human level, even if it is an anecdote. As long as the board is attuned to believing customers are important, it still has real value.
And how do you bring that into the boardroom? Because again, I'm always wary of putting the executive on the spot. So when I have something like that, I will often actually just go in a one-to-one moment before or offline, discuss it with them first. And then if it merits further discussion, bring it up. But what's your approach?
Absolutely. Yes. That's the perfect approach, to be honest. I would do the same. I think you should never walk into a boardroom with something very contrary to say, whether it's through this sort of experience or whether it's some proposal that's been put to the board that you're really not aligned to. I always think it's important to talk to the executive first for two reasons, one of which you may have completely misunderstood what they're proposing. And I've done that a few times, and I've just assumed something from the paper. And I've gone to them and said, I'm not with you on this one. And they go, that's not what we're suggesting. And you go, oh, I'm really glad I checked that with you. And the other thing it's really helpful to do is I'm a bit of a maths geek, and I quite often spot stuff in the numbers and I go, that can't possibly be right. And so then you go to the person owning the paper and you go, are you sure this number's right? And sometimes they go, oh no, good spot. No, that's not right at all. And it's much better for them to have to admit it to you, but not to the rest of the board. You build that relationship. And I think people don't mind. In fact, they're actually quite happy to have a debate if you say, I've got a different point of view. I don't particularly want to have it in front of everybody else, because then they feel they have to defend their position because it's what they put to the board. Whereas if you have it separately, you're like, oh, no, I think that's a fair comment. So let me just wind that into when I'm talking about this and I'm proposing it to you in my narrative, I'll just weave that little comment for you in because I think that is a good point and I probably should take account of it. So again, you allow them to stay in control of what they're proposing and therefore retain their sense of respect from the board. And you still get to say the thing you really want to say and change the thing you want to change. So I think you're with you. I always think that as a non-executive, only probably a third of my benefit comes from being in the board meeting. 2/3 of it comes from being outside in the organisation, talking to the executive, sharing my own experiences and helping them to think through challenges that I may have seen somewhere else as well. And so actually, when you get to the board, with a bit of luck, most of the hard work has been done and you can actually be really constructive and positive in the board because all the things you were a bit less critical have been at least taken on, or most of them, not all of them, most of them will have been dealt with separate.
As well as being a great advocate for the voice of the customer, you've been a great champion for disability in the boardroom. Can you share your own journey and experiences with disability and how they've shaped your approach to leadership and governance on the board?
It's been an interesting journey for me, this one. I was diagnosed with MS in 2009, so 15 years ago. And I had run organizations that I would say were quite unusual in some ways, in that they were very inclusive. The questions about gender and race, which we've all become very familiar with in the last decade, were relatively not visible in my organizations, not because we simply ignored them and employed lots of people who were from one background only, but actually, like when I ran Argos, I had stores that were being led by people probably from 30 or 40 different ethnic backgrounds across my organizations, and lots of women in those roles as well as men. So in all of that, I would have said we felt quite inclusive. But we didn't talk about disability at all. It just wasn't something that crossed our radar. I never thought about it. And all of a sudden in 2009, I stepped into a new community that I didn't know anything about, never really seen. And to start with, I kept that to myself. I'll be really honest. I didn't feel great about having transitioned from one community to another. It wasn't something I myself had got my head around really. And so I kept it to myself to a large, I told my boss, but I kept it from everybody else. I kept it for myself. And then gradually as my disability increased, because that's what happens in my version of MS, I got to a point where I started to have to share more widely because it became more obvious to people who were close to me that there was something. And I was going gradually on this journey. And then I moved to BT. And at the point I moved to BT, for various reasons, I decided to shift my position in terms of my disability. So I decided that over the next 5 years, it was going to become obvious that so I might as well jump before I was pushed, if you see what I mean. I wanted to jump into that community. And as I did that, I have found it a really incredibly interesting and rewarding journey to have made that transition and to begin to understand just how many customers are struggling with this. We think about 1 in 4 in the UK of people will declare that they've got some form of disability or long-term health condition. So that's 1 in 4 of my customers at BT are in these conditions. Around the FTSE 100 boards, there is only me who's declared a disability, one person out of about 1,000 probably directors. And that means that the boardrooms don't really think about what it's like to have a disability because none of them are... Either nobody's experiencing it or more likely there are many people who have disabilities around those board tables, but it's just not the thing that people talk about. And there's a bit of a sort of a societal lens that we look through at disability, I think, which says disability is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a lack of ability. And therefore we wouldn't expect these people to be running our big organizations. Whereas in truth, okay, so I can't walk because I've got MS, but actually that doesn't make me unable to translate my previous working life experience into what it means to be BT. And actually, I can now connect with 1/4 of the BT customers in a way that nobody else can around the board because I know what having a barrier looks like and I know what the sort of adjustments might want to be. And I worked in that community quite a lot. Now I've got to know loads of people who are thought leaders in there. And they share with me all the time about different segments, what it's like to be blind or deaf or indeed autistic, not living in a world that's built for us. That's what I say to people. The experience of being disabled in whichever of those cohorts you're in is the experience of living in a world that isn't built for you. And there's barriers between the world and you that other people don't experience. In the EE brand, where we're looking to go to be the most accessible brand, what we're saying to the EE team, what the EE team are understanding is people with disabilities, they want to be gamers. They're working at home. They've got families they want to involve. It's just that there are barriers between them and the EE proposition that somebody who's not disabled doesn't feel. So removing those barriers is simply making sure that those customers can access all the advantages of the brand without any of the barriers because other people don't have those barriers. So I think in that way, we're encouraging the organization to understand that there's not just a talent story for why you'd want to access this talent in your organization. There's a really strong argument for why you'll be a better, more effective organization working with customers if you've got people who understand some of the things it means to be customers. It's a bit like having a supermarket business run by all men when all the shoppers are women. We've long since moved away from thinking that's a good way to run an organization. Disability is a long way behind, but I think my goal over the next 5 years is to try to help it to accelerate on that path more rapidly through whatever interventions that I can bring to the table.
It resonates on lots of different levels. I suppose boards have so many important challenges on their plates and they haven't got enough hours in the day. My guess is there'll be people listening to this thinking, yes, that's clearly an important thing to do, but right now we've got X, Y, and Z that are higher priorities. What's your message for that board member? What's the case for them to reallocate how they're thinking about allocating that time and thinking about disability in the boardroom?
I think there are 2 stories to say to people, one of which is a straightforward commercial story, which is 1 in 4 of your customers has got this. There's real evidence that people who address that customer segment can grow, and growth is very hard to come by in lots of established organizations these days. So anything that looks like it's the way to drive growth, which isn't simply about making your products cheaper and easier to access, but actually is really meeting a proper customer need that's not currently met, is a good opportunity. Second thing I think is disability plays into the broader question of inclusive cultures. And one of the things we know for sure is that the younger generation coming into organizations are much more demanding and have much higher expectations about the inclusivity. And whether that's gender, race, LGBTQ+, or whether it's social mobility or whether it's disability, there's just a sense in the younger generation that they're way less judgmental than the older generations are. And they expect a much greater absorption of people with different sorts of backgrounds. And therefore, that's your talent pipeline. And they're going to be asking really tough questions about what you're doing to create an inclusive culture, not just about disability, but all sorts of other things. And I think, therefore, there's a big commercial opportunity. And I think it also plays into a challenge to make your businesses more inclusive so that they're more attractive to the newer talent that's coming into the market.
So I can imagine there'll be people listening to this now going, gosh, Sarah, you've convinced me I need to do something about this. We've never had a discussion at the board level about disability. What are 3 practical things that they could, as a board member, activate on their boards to have the highest impact?
The first thing I would do is gather the data. And by gather the data, I mean Work out how many people say they're disabled in the HR system. Look at your staff survey and see how many people said they were disabled. And I would guess on your HR system, that'll be about 6 or 7%. In the staff survey, it'll be about 20. So get those data. Ask if you know how many customers are disabled. Do you adapt your products and services for customers? Is your website accessible? So the first thing I would do is just ask a lot of questions. In the conference, we give people a diagnostic to basically work through with about 40 questions. We say, here's those things. This will tell you where you're still on the starting block, whether you're halfway down the runway or whether you're not even at the starting block yet. It'll give you a bit of a diagnostic and it'll help you to think about what's first. So I definitely do that. Second thing I definitely do is I go and check your workplace adjustments process. How easy is it to get adjustments? How many people ask and how long does it take? And how many do we say no to? Because if it doesn't work, and it's a bit like measuring all your customer processes, you'll be measuring how long does it take me to get a mortgage offered somebody or whatever your customer process is. Do it the same on your workplace adjustment process inside, because it's one of the most powerful ways of convincing people with disabilities in the organisation that you mean business when you say, I want you to feel more included. And then I think the other thing I would do is then go check that you've got an employee resource group for both physical and mental disabilities, and that you've got somebody who is the executive leader for that group. So the employee resource group will be run by employees and it will be chaired by an employee. But actually, in all the organizations I work in, that employee has a board member or an executive committee member who's their buddy, effectively, and who brings their story to the board, because that's a great way of understanding what is it that the employee resource group think are the things that they'd like to see. And if you've got a board sponsor for that who has a voice at the board, that's a good way of getting that done. So I think I'd check your status of your ERG, make sure it's properly structured, you get the voice through to the board, check your workplace adjustment process, and do a scan of your data so that you know where you're starting from. And as a board, decide which bits of that are most important to you. Is it the customer story that's most important to you? Is it the engagement story that's most important? And then, which you can't do that question without the data. So gather your data first, check your workplace adjustment process, make sure you've got a good ERG structure, and you'll be on the way at that point. You'll see that will put lights on the path and you'll start to see what are the steps on the path that I need to be taking.
Sara, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to say a short statement and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Yeah. Okay.
Best book every board member should read and why?
My favourite at the moment, it won't surprise anybody to know, it's a book about disability inclusion at work, is Positively Purple by Kate Nash.
Boardroom behaviour that irritates you most?
People presenting the slides that they've sent me in advance and which I've diligently read because I'm a very diligent board member. So they send out the pack in advance, you diligently work your way through it, and then they come into the board meeting and insist on presenting every slide. And I'm going, why did I bother to read this pack if you're going to present it all to me?
Most valuable board ritual?
Checking off of actions arising and making sure that actions have been done. We concentrate a lot on board about what we say and what we put in and what we think we've landed on the day. But the risk is it gets written in the minutes and nobody ever does anything with it.
Favourite quote?
One at the moment for me is, attitude is a small thing that means a lot. It's a Winston Churchill quote, as all my favourites are, to be honest. But I do think that, and I apply it to my own situation a lot, there are days when I just feel that there's a lot of stuff stacked against me. And it's easy to get demoralised on days like that. But the truth is, you don't generate either pleasure in your own life or engagement and motivation for other people to help you if you're constantly focused on the stuff that you dislike. And I do always think that you have the opportunity to choose your attitude to things. And I choose to look at what can be done and what's possible and try not to let myself be tied down by the many things that isn't. I often say to people, none of us ever recruit somebody for the things they can't do. We only recruit them for the things they can. And so I don't want to live my life focusing on the things I can't do. I really want to focus on the stuff I can do and make the most of it. So that sense of attitude is a small thing that means a lot. I think for me, because you own your own attitude, it's something I can't change my disability, but I can change my attitude towards it. And that is quite powerful.
Most significant professional insight?
I think that customers, although customers differ, I think my observation of having worked around lots of sectors is there's an awful lot of things, because the people who buy bank accounts are the same people who are buying kettles at Argos and the same people who are drawing their state pension or whatever it is. Whatever sector you're in, actually, you think those are very different, but the customers are the same people.
Worst professional advice you've ever received?
Actually, I've been very lucky in my later professional career, I have to say. But the anecdote I always smile at is when I was at school and I was very bright and I was very studious and I was particularly good at maths. I particularly loved maths. I went to a careers advice session and they said to me, you could be an actuary, but you need to be really bright to be an actuary. So maybe you should be an underwriter. And I went home to my mum and I said, they've told me I should be an underwater. Underwater what? Because they'd obviously written not very well. I didn't know what an underwriter was. And that sense that I should be an underwriter, and nothing in my career, I think, could have been a worse decision than to go off and be an underwriter. Sorry to any underwriters who are listening, but actually I did love numbers. I probably could have been an actuary if I'd wanted to, but my business career has taken me a lot more into understanding people and how people engage with businesses, which, much though I love numbers, is probably still a more interesting space to have ended up in.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
When I started working on boards, because I came from being an executive, I was very dismissive of process. I only really wanted to talk about outcomes, as I would have done as an executive. And so all the sense of the governance of the board was all a bit tiresome, really. And I still prefer board meetings with lots of content in them rather than lots of process. But I think I have begun to be more respectful of the value of the process and the conversations about how decisions get made and who makes those decisions and the clarity of that. Because I've seen enough organizations now and done enough effectiveness evaluations. But one of the most crippling things for an organization is not to have clarity about who makes decisions.
Finally, what 3 things should our listeners take away from this podcast if they take nothing else?
My first one is do work that you love. I'm fundamentally a believer in you're better doing stuff that you love. And if you do stuff you love and you do it really well, somebody will give you something else to do. When I do student feedback at my college and careers advice, and they say, oh, my mum wants me to be a lawyer or something, and I don't really want to do it. I said, do stuff you love, because if you go into a job you don't love, you'll be rubbish at it and nobody will promote you and that'll be it. If you go to a job you love and people see you doing it really well, go, oh, I could have that person on my team and actually I could fit them into this space. So work you love is always really important to me. I've learned a lot about diversity and I really would say to people, embrace diversity, not because it's politically correct to do so, but because 6 people with 6 different perspectives will give you better results than 6 really good people with the same perspective. And then my last one would be, if you're a commercial person and somebody suggests that you go into the public sector, don't turn it down because you think they're all bureaucrats and pen pushers, because actually some of the biggest problems in this country are sitting in the public sector to be solved. And if you can learn how to bring your commercial expertise and translate it in something that's useful in the public sector, you can be part of conversations about things that are way bigger than anything any individual business will ever be tackling. If you're offered an opportunity to cross that Rubicon into the public sector, don't turn it down. Just go and have a look, because some of it can be absolutely fascinating.
Sarah, that has been hugely thought-provoking and inspiring in equal measure. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
Thank you for having me, Oliver.
Building a non-exec career is hard. For those starting out, boards can be opaque. For more experienced board members, it can be lonely and hard to stay match fit. Having placed almost 4,000 people on boards in the last 5 years, we know what success looks like. It requires time, energy, resilience, information, and connections. New Role Plus, our community of board peers, exists to give you these things, offering you wholesale support as you try to get board roles and become a standout Ned. Find out more at newrole.com/newrole-plus. That's newrole.com/newrole-plus.